As the investigation would later establish, it all started with his face. He reminded her too much of one person, his mother, and that was enough for a 6-year-old to be brought unconscious to the emergency room of Novoanninskaya District Hospital on June 14, 2021. Standing nearby were his father and stepmother. She explained to the doctors that about a week earlier he had fallen from a tree while playing in the yard and landed badly. He'd been complaining of headaches since then, but they thought it would pass on its own. Nothing serious, just one of those things. The doctors examined him and understood it wouldn't pass. Closed cranial trauma, subdural hemorrhage, swelling, displacement of structures inside the skull. This wasn't a fall from a tree. This was something else entirely. He was transferred to intensive care, but he never regained consciousness. By that evening, he was gone. Galushkinsky settlement, 867 people according to the last census. Volgograd Oblast, Novoanninsky District, a place where everyone knows everyone, where news travels faster than events happen. But this particular story wasn't fully known, or rather, not everything behind it was. Investigators began their inquiry, examined the house, interviewed neighbors. The neighbors reported that screams were regularly heard from this house, not once or twice, but constantly. They'd seen him outside, undressed, even in cold weather. He would stand by the porch and not go inside. He simply wasn't allowed in. He looked thin, frightened, nothing like the others. There were 5 children in the family, but only one of them raised concerns. No one called the police. No one filed a report. A small settlement isn't a city. People don't interfere in others' affairs here. Here, they say, parents know best how to raise their children. The case was reclassified. Article 117 of the Criminal Code, systematic infliction of harm. Paragraphs G and E of Part 2, against someone knowingly helpless in material or other dependence on the perpetrator. The stepmother was detained, the father too, but they didn't get the chance to interrogate him. A few hours later, when it became clear that the truth would come out, he took his own life. Only she remained. The investigation began with interviews. First, they called in those who lived across the fence, across the street, 2 houses down. Galushkinsky settlement, a place where sounds carry far, especially screams. The neighbors started talking. Some had heard crying, regular, almost on schedule. Others noticed he looked nothing like the rest of the family, thin, silent, with a haunted look in his eyes. Others remembered that once he approached their fence and asked for food, just walked up and asked, no one called, not once in 18 months. Why? The answers were similar. We thought the parents knew what they were doing. We didn't want to interfere in someone else's family. We were afraid of ruining relationships. We decided it was their private matter. Investigators documented everything. The picture began to take shape. This was no accident. This was a system. Long, methodical, invisible to those who didn't want to see. The stepmother's story fell apart within the first 24 hours. The medical examination showed that the head injury could not have resulted from a single fall a week ago. The nature of the damage indicated repeated impacts to the same area at different intervals. Signs of old injuries. Signs of systematic harm. The case was transferred to the District Investigative Department, but the investigation already understood. This wasn't just about the injuries. This was about consequences that led to him ending up in intensive care and never leaving. They began reconstructing the timeline. Who did what and when? How long had this been going on? Why did no one intervene? And most importantly, why him? After all, there were 5 children in the family. The stepmother's son from her first marriage, 2 daughters of the father from his first marriage, a shared daughter born in July 2019, and him, also from the father's first marriage, the only one treated differently. The investigation began searching for a reason and found it in the stepmother's own testimony. September 2018, a 34-year-old woman marries a widower. She has a son from her first marriage. He has 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. His first wife had already passed away by then. The new family settles in Galushkinsky settlement. At first glance, a story about a second chance. A widower found a woman who could become a support for his orphaned children. A woman found a husband and a large family. A house, a household, stability. Everything needed for a normal life together in a place where everyone knows each other. The first months passed without incident. At least, neither neighbors nor relatives recalled anything alarming from that period. The family seemed ordinary. Large, not wealthy, but quite ordinary. In July 2019, a shared daughter was born. The family officially received the status of a large family, which meant benefits, payments, attention from social services. But the attention turned out to be formal. The family wasn't on any watch list. For Child Protective Services, they were just an ordinary large family. No complaints, no signals, no grounds for inspections. No one came for surprise visits. No one spoke with neighbors. No one looked at how these 5 actually lived. But inside the house, distinctions had already begun. The stepmother was raising 4. Her son, the husband's 2 daughters, and the youngest daughter. With them, according to witness testimony and case materials, there were no problems. She fed them, clothed them, cared for them. An ordinary mother. An ordinary stepmother. But there was one more, the husband's son from his first marriage. He was 5 when it all began, 6 when it all ended. With him, everything was different. The investigation established that the stepmother came to despise specifically him. Not immediately, not on the first day, but by January 2020, the hatred had transformed into action. And the reason for these actions lay not in the stepson's behavior, not in his character, not in what he did or didn't do. The reason was his face. He resembled his mother more than his sisters did. The same features, the same gaze, the same face shape. When the stepmother looked at him, she didn't see a stepson. She saw the woman who came before her, the deceased, the one whose place she had taken. And this isn't a metaphor. This is the wording from the case materials. The court established that the cause of the hatred toward the stepson was his physical resemblance to his biological mother, irrational jealousy toward someone who no longer existed, who couldn't respond, couldn't protect, couldn't even know what was happening to her son. But she continued to exist. In his eyes, in his features, in his appearance. Every time the stepmother saw the stepson, she saw a reminder that her husband had loved another woman, that these 3 weren't hers, that she was second, always. The husband's 2 daughters were probably also similar to the deceased, but not as strongly. Either the stepmother didn't notice, or she learned not to notice. But him, she couldn't. His face became a trigger for her, constant, daily, unbearable. In January 2020, the hatred stopped being just a feeling. It began turning into action. But the stepmother didn't start herself. She first prepared the ground. The first one she broke was the father. Systematically, day after day, she turned the husband against his own son. The court subsequently established that she instilled in him feelings of indifference and cruelty. This is a quote from the verdict. What did this look like in practice? Probably like ordinary conversations, like complaints. He's being difficult because his mother raised him that way. He doesn't listen. It's her genes. He looks at me, and I see her. Day after day, week after week, the father began to change. The one who should have protected became an accomplice. The one who represented the last connection to a normal life severed that connection himself. By the end of January 2020, the preparation was complete. The harm began. From January 2020, the harm became regular. Case materials document that he was struck with a belt, sticks, metal buckets, and he was only 6. Both of them did it. The stepmother and the father. The same father she had already reprogrammed. Who had stopped seeing his own son in him, who now also saw in him a source of irritation, a reminder of the past. A problem that needed to be solved. What was he harmed for? The court established, for any transgression, or for no transgression at all. Simply because his face made the stepmother angry. Simply because he existed. Because she could. 18 months. From January 2020 to June 2021. 540 days. But the physical harm wasn't all. She found methods that don't leave bruises, that are hard to notice, that can be denied. Hunger. He wasn't always fed with the others. Sometimes he just watched as others ate. Sometimes he wasn't at the table at all. Not constantly, from time to time. Enough not to push things to extremes, but enough for him to remember his place. Cold. In cold weather, he was sent outside undressed. Galushkinsky settlement is in Volgograd Oblast. In winter, it's -15, -20 Celsius. He stood in the frost without clothes. He wasn't let back inside. The neighbors saw this. They remembered during interrogations. Yes, they saw. Yes, he stood there, undressed. They thought he was being punished for something. It happens. From systematic exposure to cold, he developed health conditions. The open case materials don't specify exactly which ones, but they appeared. His body began to give out. He was only 6, and they didn't take him to doctors, didn't show him to anyone, kept him inside, in an enclosed space, a system where he was guilty simply for having been born, for having survived, and for resembling the one the stepmother despised. 18 months, and no one intervened. For 18 months, the system didn't see what was happening, what no one reported, because reporting means intervening. And intervening isn't done here. This rule worked flawlessly, until it was too late. Later, when everything was over, the neighbors gave testimony, detailed, precise, with dates and specifics. They remembered everything they had seen and heard over those 18 months. They told the investigators. They helped reconstruct the full picture of what had happened. But by that point, there was no one left to help. The one for whom it would have been worth calling 18 months earlier could no longer tell his own story. May 12, 2021. The first of 3 impacts that would ultimately end in intensive care. The yard of the house, a concrete walkway, the stepmother nearby. What exactly happened between them at that moment? The case materials state briefly. She pushed him hard. He fell. His back and the back of his head hit the concrete directly. His scalp split open. He lies on the concrete walkway with his head injured. The stepmother looks at him and makes a decision. She didn't take him to the hospital. Why? The court established she was afraid they would see the marks there, that they would start asking questions, that everything happening in this house would be exposed. Bruises, marks from the belt, marks from sticks, marks from metal buckets, malnutrition, exposure to cold. One appearance in the emergency room, and the entire system they had built over 18 months would collapse in an instant. She chose not to take him. She bandaged the wound herself, with what and how, exactly unknown. Probably with bandages, as best she could, without antiseptics, without stitches, without proper examination, a split scalp, and home bandaging instead of medical care. He stayed home, with an unsutured wound on his head, with pain that no one would relieve, and with the stepmother who had just pushed him onto the concrete. 15 days passed. The wound wasn't healing properly. His head hurt. But they still weren't taking him to the hospital, because there would be questions, doctors who know how to look, and that would be the end of everything. They kept waiting, hoping it would pass on its own, that things would work out, that no one would find out. On May 27th, the second impact came, and everything got worse. May 27th, 2021, 15 days after the fall onto concrete, the wound on the back of his head still hadn't healed. No stitches, no proper treatment, and no medical care whatsoever. An open laceration that they kept at home, hoping it would pass on its own. That day, the father was the one who struck. First with a belt. This had already become routine. He had been doing this for 18 months, ever since he'd been convinced it was right. Then he grabbed him by the head and struck it against the doorframe, into the same wound, into the same back of the head, into the exact spot that was already injured, more damage. The wound reopened. The unsutured laceration received repeated trauma, even more serious than the first. Again, they didn't take him to a doctor. Again, they bandaged him at home, left things as they were, without examination, without help, and without any chance of proper treatment. Inside his head, something began happening that no one on the outside could see. Repeated trauma to the same location isn't just pain, it's accumulated damage. It's what doctors would later call blunt closed head trauma, what would gradually lead to hemorrhaging beneath the dura mater, a process that could no longer be stopped without urgent medical intervention. On the outside, everything looked almost the same as before. He walked, talked, existed. He complained of headaches. But who cared about that in this house? Who would listen to him? They already considered him a problem here. Another 17 days passed, during which a real catastrophe was slowly unfolding inside his skull. On June 13th, the third impact came, and it was the last. June 13th, 2021. The father struck him in the head with his fist, the third time in 32 days, and to the same head, and to the unhealed laceration that had already received 2 impacts, first against concrete, then against the door frame. Inside, processes were already underway that no one saw or wanted to notice. A fist to the head of a 6-year-old. What happened next is documented in the court materials down to the hour, the night of June 13th to 14th. He barely slept, cried, complained of severe headache and dizziness all night, hour after hour. Adults were in the house, along with 4 other children. Someone heard the crying, someone saw how sick he was, and no one called an ambulance. No one dialed 3 digits. No one decided it was finally time to seek help. In the morning, he began feeling nauseous, then vomiting. These are classic symptoms of cranial trauma. This is something any paramedic would recognize in a minute. This is a signal screaming, "There's a catastrophe inside the head, urgent help is needed," and they still weren't taking him to a doctor. Still hoping, still stalling. By 1 in the afternoon, he went out to the yard and sat in the sandbox. And there he lost consciousness. Only then did the father finally take him to Novoanninskaya District Hospital. 32 days, 3 impacts to the head, 1 unsutured wound, a night of crying and pain, a morning of vomiting, and only losing consciousness in a sandbox made them seek help. June 14th, second half of the day. He was brought in unconscious. The father and stepmother stood nearby. The doctors examined him. The diagnosis, the one that would later appear in all case materials, blunt closed head trauma, subdural hemorrhage, cerebral edema, and dislocation. Dislocation, that's when structures shift inside the skull. When pressure becomes so great that the brain literally changes position. When almost nothing can be done anymore because time has been lost forever. He was transferred to intensive care, and there he remained until evening, unconscious with no chance of pulling through. Meanwhile, the stepmother was giving explanations to the staff and investigators. The story was prepared in advance. He fell from a tree about a week ago. He was playing in the yard, climbed it, landed badly. He'd been complaining of headaches since then, but they thought it would pass. An accident, no one's fault. It just happened. She said this calmly and confidently, as if she'd rehearsed, as if she knew this moment would come someday, and had prepared for it in advance. A polished story meant to explain everything and close the matter. The doctors wrote down her words. The investigators wrote them down too. Later, they would verify every detail, and on the evening of June 14th, he passed away in intensive care. 32 days had passed since the first impact, 18 months since the systematic harm began, and almost 3 years since his father married this woman. The investigation began that same evening, examination of the house, interviewing neighbors, checking the tree story, and that story began falling apart by the next day. Neighbors told investigators what they had seen and heard over 18 months. None of it fit the picture of an accident while playing in a tree. The medical examination added details that completely destroyed this version. The nature of the head injury didn't match a single fall. The damage indicated repeated impacts to the same area at different intervals. Old injuries were found on the body, signs of systematic harm, as well as malnutrition and health conditions consistent with prolonged exposure to cold. He was deprived of food while others ate, sent out into the frost undressed, and no one protected him because there was nowhere to run. The stepmother was detained, the father too. Both were to answer for everything that had happened in this house. But something happened with the father that the investigation didn't expect. When he realized the truth would come out, when it became clear that the neighbors had started talking, that the examination would reveal everything, that the lie about the tree hadn't worked, he made a decision. That same day, in the first hours after detention, the father took his own life. Criminal prosecution against him was terminated. There was no one left to prosecute. It's important to understand what this meant for the case. The one who struck with his fist, with a belt, who slammed the head against the doorframe, could no longer be held accountable. The one who struck on that very night of June 13th would never stand trial. Only she remained. The one who started all of this, who despised the stepson for his face, for reminding her of the deceased, who turned an ordinary widower into an accomplice in the systematic harm of his own son. She would face trial, and the investigation continued gathering materials, now only against her. The investigation continued its work. At some point, a fact emerged in the case materials that changed the entire picture of what had happened. Child Protective Services knew, not after the tragedy, but before. Before he was brought to the hospital unconscious, before he passed away, before the father took his own life. Child Services had filed a lawsuit to strip the stepmother of parental rights, based on the grounds they had at the time, meaning the system had worked. Someone saw, someone raised the alarm, someone went to court, and the court denied the petition. Why? The wording from the case materials reads as follows. She treated the other members of her spouse's family well, the 2 daughters well, the shared daughter well, her son from her first marriage also well, but not the stepson. Yet the court looked at the other 4 and decided, since everything is fine with them, the overall situation is acceptable, 1 out of 5. 1 is being harmed, starved, sent out into the frost undressed. 4 are not, and the court chose to look at the 4. At those with whom everything was fine, the petition was denied. The stepmother remained in the house, continued doing what she was doing, continued the harm, continued the starvation, continued sending him out into the cold. Because the court had given her that right with its denial, the system saw and decided not to intervene, not because there were no grounds. There were grounds sufficient for Child Services to go to court with a petition to strip parental rights. But the court decided otherwise, looked at the paperwork, at the formal indicators, at the 4 who were fine. The case was closed. This is probably the most terrifying fact in this entire story. Not that the neighbors stayed silent, that's understandable. That's human weakness. That's the tradition of not meddling in others' affairs. Not that the father became an accomplice. That's also explainable, though awful, repulsive. Because he was broken, reprogrammed, turned against his own son. But that the system worked and still didn't help. They saw the problem, filed a petition, the court reviewed the materials, and denied it. Formally, legally, following all procedures, with justification that could be filed away, and after that denial, more months, more strikes with the belt, sticks, metal buckets, hunger when he watched others eat, and cold when he was sent outside undressed, and the finale, in the intensive care unit of Novoanninskaya Hospital, from which he never emerged. Novoanninsky District Court issued the verdict against the stepmother, the very same court in the very same district that had once denied the petition to strip her of parental rights. The stepmother fully admitted her guilt, expressed remorse, gave detailed testimony, described how everything happened, explained her actions, cried, or pretended to cry, asked the court for leniency, cited circumstances, cited remorse, cited that she has other children who need raising. The verdict: 4 years and 6 months of imprisonment in a general regime penal colony for 18 months of systematic harm, for the hunger when he watched others eat, for the cold when he was sent out into the frost, for 3 impacts to the head over 32 days, for not taking him to the hospital on May 12th, for his passing away in intensive care without ever regaining consciousness. 4.5 years. For all of this, just 4 years. But that's not all. At the time of sentencing, the convicted woman had 2 minors, her son from her first marriage and a shared daughter with her late husband. At the time the verdict was issued, the youngest was only 2 years old. The court applied a deferment of sentence until the youngest reaches 14 years of age. 2 plus 12, meaning a deferment of 12 years until 2033. Here's what this means in practice. A woman convicted of systematic harm that led to a 6-year-old stepson ending up in intensive care and not surviving, this woman walked out of the courtroom a free person and remains free to this day. She will raise her children, the very ones for whom she was given this deferment. She will live in the same settlement or move somewhere else. That's unknown. She will be free. She will walk the streets, buy groceries, meet neighbors, live an ordinary life. The verdict could have been appealed. It didn't take legal effect immediately. Whether the defense or prosecution appealed it, there's no information in open sources. Unknown so far. Whether anyone tried to achieve actual imprisonment without deferment, unknown. Whether the question was raised of whether the remaining children can be entrusted to her, unknown. But the result is known. She remained free, and will remain free for many more years, until her youngest daughter turns 14. The one who was only 6 passed away in intensive care on June 14, 2021. The cause? Blunt closed head trauma. The investigation established 18 months of systematic harm, 3 impacts to the head over 32 days, deliberate refusal of medical care when something could still have been done. The father took his own life after realizing the truth would come out. Criminal prosecution against him ended. The one who struck with his fist and slammed the head against the doorframe will never stand trial. The stepmother was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months in a general regime colony. She received a deferment of 12 years until her youngest daughter turns 14. She walked out of the courtroom free and continues raising her children to this day. She remains free with her children until 2033, when her youngest turns 14. If by then the statute of limitations hasn't expired, if by then nothing else happens, if anyone even remembers, but he is already gone. Since the evening of June 14, 2021, he was 6, and he looked too much like his mother. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Like, subscribe to our channel. See you next time.